Okay, so just a brief review of what we spoke about last time. So we were analyzing the places in Tanakh where a prophet says, Ra'iti Hashem, that he saw God, and we mentioned the places are as follows. We have in Sefer Shemot, we have Moshe Rabbeinu together with Aaron and the Zekenim. They all, it says that they, Vayir'u et Elokei Israel, that they saw God. Then we have the second place in Tanakh, we have Michayu ben Imla in his vision to Achav before the king Achav goes to war and ultimately dies in that war. We have Michayu claiming that he saw God. Then we have both Yeshayahu and Amos at the same time stating that they saw Hashem. And finally, a similar expression we find in, later in history, we find in Yechezkel, who also says, Vayre'eh marot Elokim. So we studied last week more in detail the story of Michayu ben Imla. And just to sum up what we saw there, we saw basically Achav and Yehoshaphat were thinking of going to war against Aram. Achav wanted Yehoshaphat to join with him in the war against Aram. Aram is again a nation up in what we call modern day Syria. And Achav wanted to conquer a certain territory that had previously belonged to the kingdom of Israel. And Yehoshaphat asked him to check with a prophet of Hashem before he goes to war. He gathers together 400 prophets of Hashem. They all tell you will be successful. Then they invite Michayu ben Imla, who says, you will die in this war. That's essentially his prophecy. And Michayu ben Imla says that essentially all these 400 prophets are being set up. In other words, Hashem gave them a false prophecy to try to mislead Achav to go to war, but the true prophecy is Michayu's prophecy that Achav will ultimately die in this war and the rest of the people will return home safely. Achav decides to go to war, but being very concerned for his safety, tries to do two things. One is he puts Michayu ben Imla in prison and says, your freedom hinges on my safety. And the second thing that he does, he doesn't go out to the war in his normal royal clothing and royal chariot. Rather, he goes up dressed up as a simple soldier. It doesn't help him. A straight arrow somehow finds its way in between the spacings in between his armor, and he dies, and the prophecy of Michayu is fulfilled. Now, he said, this is a very peculiar way. If Hashem wants Achav to die, it's a very peculiar way to take 400 prophets, and these are supposedly righteous people. I mean, they were prophets of Hashem. They seemingly had done nothing wrong, and to make them all into false prophets. You know, fine, if you want Achav to die, that's good and well. You know, he was an evil king, and he certainly deserved it. But why go about it in such a strange way? So we tried to answer that perhaps there's a message here. And that message is as follows, that from now on, in those times, we can see clearly from a number of stories in Tanakh of around that period, that prophecy was something widespread. There were schools of prophets, tens and hundreds of prophets, if not more. Chazal actually say that in those times, there were thousands of prophets. I'll just show you quickly on the screen where Chazal say that. Here it is. We have a midrash in Shir HaShirim Rabbah that says, Rabbi Drosa veRabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak, 60 ribo nevi'im amdu lehem liYisrael b'yimei Eliyahu. Yimei Eliyahu, again, this is the times of Achav. The main prophet at that time was Eliyahu, although we spoke about this one specific story that we studied was Michai, who was the prophet active there. But the main prophet that went to battle against Achav was Eliyahu. And so Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak says there were 600,000 prophets. Rabbi Yaakov b'shem Rabbi Yochanan amar 120 ribo. Okay, in other words, double that, double 600,000. In other words, 1,200,000. Again, a ribo is 10,000. So either 60 times 10,000 or 120 times 10,000. In other words, we mentioned in the past that anytime Chazal used this expression of 600,000 or double that, what it means is it's not to be taken literally, just means a very large figure. and it's based on the 600,000 men that exited, came out of Egypt. That's why it's the number that they use when they want to say a very large number. But the idea is that prophecy at that time was very widespread. From this point onwards in Tanakh, we don't find such large groups of prophets. We find single prophets. You could have more than one prophet in a generation, but we have no evidence that it was such a widespread phenomenon. So it seems that this is sort of what happened in this story of Yeshayahu, that essentially God is also sending a message that prophecy is not going to be found amongst the multitudes anymore. It's going to be only delivered to single people. And that's why if you see 400 prophets saying one thing and one prophet saying the contrary, actually the truth is that with that one prophet. And the message in that is essentially that the connection between God and the Jewish people, has been reduced and more limited. Ultimately, the ideal would be, like Moshe Rabbeinu says, Mi tenet kol am Hashem neviim, like we read in the Torah a few weeks ago. Moshe Rabbeinu says, the ideal would be for the entire Jewish people to become prophets. And that's one of the prophecies for the future of a mala'ah haaretz de'at Hashem, that everybody will know God and everybody will have this sort of more direct connection with God. But at this point in time anyway, beyond the specific message to Achav, there seems to be a general message that now prophecy is changing, and only a very select few will receive prophecy. And essentially, if we put all the dots together, anytime we see a prophet saying Ra'iti et Hashem, in essence, it's a message to us. What does it mean that he says he's seen God? The idea is that he's seen God in a different place than he was previously. What does that mean? It means in respect to us, God's connection with the world has changed. So in Har Sinai, it was a very positive change. They saw God. In other words, God now becomes more present in the world and more connected with the nation of Israel. In the times of Yeshayahu, that's being reduced. In other words, he's seeing God, but God is now being more removed. We're not going to have prophecy as a widespread phenomenon. It's going to be only a select few. Now, if we move on to Yeshayahu and Amos, they're also saying there's a shift. And I'll try to explain what that shift is about. Essentially, from when the Beit HaMikdash was built, in other words, when David HaMelech chose Yerushalayim to be the presence, the set place for where the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, will be built, and Shlomo HaMelech built it, everybody was quite secure that this is the place where God resides. That's the idea of the Beit HaMikdash, the Shekhinah. That's where the presence of God is located. That's where the connection is between the world and God. And it seemed that always, until this point in Yeshayahu, that this was on firm footing. Okay, this was not something that was going to change. The first time that we see that the Beit HaMikdash is in danger is here in this prophecy of Yeshayahu and Amos. And why is that? How do we see that? So, first of all, the main way we see that is the earthquake, right? We said that there was a ra'ash. This was the ra'ash b'imei Uziyahu, the earthquake that occurred in the times of Uziyahu. Where did that earthquake occur? It occurred in Yerushalayim. That's where it was. And in essence, the earthquake is a message that the Beit HaMikdash is not on firm footing anymore. Okay? This is not something that is necessarily going to last forever. Now, Yeshayahu is not yet saying that it definitely will be destroyed, but he's already, and we'll see this later on, he's already alluding to that possibility. And one of the ways that that message is being said is through this earthquake. In other words, if the doorposts, as we saw of the Beit HaMikdash, are shaking, it means that the Beit HaMikdash could fall down. It's not so stable anymore. And that's part of the message of Yeshayahu in this prophecy. And this is also, we can also see this from the parallel prophecy of Amos. Let me show you why. Let's read again the verse from Amos. This is something quite interesting. If you read the words of Amos very closely, let me find it. A second. Here we go. Okay, it says here in Amos, where he says, Ra'iti et Hashem, so he says, Ra'iti et Adonai, nitzav al hamizbeach, ויאמר הך הכפתור וירעשו הסיפים ובצעם בראש כולם וחביתם בחרב הרוג, לא ינוס להם נס ולא יימלט להם פליט. Now I want to focus on one point in this verse, and that is where he sees God. He says, ראיתי את השם, ניצב על המזבח, standing by the altar. Okay, now, can anybody tell me what's the problem with that? What's wrong with God being by the altar?
Well,
yes. Yes.
Hashem is usually by the kruvim. He's not by the altar, isn't he? And
correct.
Perhaps it's a remez, maybe it's a remez to the Ketoret that was, maybe it's the Mizbech of Ketoret, I don't know which order it is, and it's a remez to what one should be doing. It was the chet, the Asham that was done by Yeshayahu.
Right, excellent, very good point. Okay, just to sort of, let's try to sort of illustrate, the Beit HaMikdash in our minds. So you have the innermost place in the Beit HaMikdash is the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. In the Holy of Holies, we have the Aron, the Ark, with the Keruvim on top of it, the cherubs, and that is the innermost place. Nobody enters that place except for the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, as we know, where he enters with the Ketoret. But that is supposed to be the residing place of Hashem. For example, we read in the Torah, when Moshe Rabbeinu received, once the Mishkan was built, Moshe Rabbeinu received prophecies. Where did he hear God's voice coming from? From Miben Shnei HaKruvim, from between the two Kruvim, the two cherubs which were on top of the Aron. Okay, so the presence of God is supposed to be inside the Holy of Holies. Where is the altar? So actually, there were two altars in the Beit HaMikdash. There was the Mizbeach HaZahav, the golden altar, which was just outside the Holy of Holies. It was what we call the Heichal. The Heichal is sort of the chamber that leads up to Kodesh HaKodashim. And in that chamber, you have the Mizbeach HaZahav, you have the menorah, and you have the Shulchan, the table with the special bread. And there was another altar outside in the courtyard, which was called the Mizbeach HaNechoshet, on which all the sacrifices were offered. And that was the big altar. So in essence, the big altar was outside in the courtyard, and that was the primary altar where all the sacrifices were offered. And there was a more inner altar, the Mizbeach HaZahav, the golden altar, on which it was basically used just for the Ketoret. Again, the spices that would burn and the smoke, and it was also used on Yom Kippur for putting some of the blood of the sacrifices. Either way, whether we don't know which Mizbeach necessarily Amos is referring to that he saw God, but that's not where God is supposed to be. He's supposed to be, in other words, his presence is supposed to be in the Kodesh HaKodashim, in the Holy of Holies. What is he doing on the Mizbeach? So Chazal answer this question sort of indirectly, but they tell us the following idea. Let me put this on the source pages. The answer they give is as follows. This is a Gemara in Masechet Rosh Hashanah on page 31a. And they say as follows. Amar Rav Yehuda bar Idi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, 10 מסעות נשאה שכינה מקראי, וכנגדן גלתה סנהדרין מגמרא. Okay, so what's going on here? Rabbi Yehuda bar Idi said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, the divine presence traveled 10 journeys, as is derived from verses. In other words, the destruction again, these are sort of events which lead up to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. But in essence, Chazal say that it wasn't sort of a, wham bam process, that one day God was there in the temple and the next day he was gone. Rather, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, went through, sort of traveled through 10 journeys, 10 locations until it, returned to the heavens. And Kenegdan Galta Sanhedrin, also the Sanhedrin, which was, the supreme rabbinical body, which was also located in the Beit HaMikdash, also went through 10 journeys, 10 exiles until, it ceased to exist. So what are the 10 places that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, left? So it says as follows: Mikaporet lekruv. Okay, so the first one was from the kaporet. Kaporet is the covering of the ark. So it went to the kruv, to one of the cherub. Umikruv lekruv, from one cherub to the other cherub. Umikruv lamiftan, from the second cherub to the threshold of the sanctuary. Umimiftan lachatzer, from the threshold to the courtyard. Umichatzer lamizbeach, from the courtyard to the altar. Umimizbeach lagag, from the altar to the roof. Umigag lechoma, from the roof to the wall of the city, or the wall of the Temple Mount. Umichoma la'ir, from the wall of the Temple Mount to the city of Yerushalayim. Umi'ir lahar, from the city of Yerushalayim to the mountain. Umihar lamidbar, from the mountain to the wilderness. Umimidbar alta v'yashva v'mekoma, and from the desert it returned to the heavens. Shenemar elcha shuva el mekomi. Okay, so this Gemara here is describing sort of the journey of the divine presence as going in 10 stages. Again, the first, in other words, it's supposed to be on the kaporet, right? That's the covering of the ark. So the first few stages are still within the Kodesh of Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies. It's going within the Holy of Holies from place to place. Then it reaches the threshold. Then from the threshold, he goes out to the courtyard. And from the courtyard to the altar. So the altar, let's say, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's stop number 5 on its journey before returning to the heavens. Now, the Gemara then goes on to prove all of these journeys from Psukim. And which Pasuk does it bring to prove that the Shekhinah had gone to the Mizbeach? Our Pasuk in Amos. In other words, the verse that we just saw, Ra'iti et Hashem nitzav al HaMizbeach, when Amos is witnessing God's presence on the Mizbeach, that's essentially the 5th journey of the Shekhinah on its way out. And, the last journey we know occurred after the destruction of the temple. But in essence, what Amos is telling us, if he's seeing, again, we're combining these various little points, but we have an earthquake on the temple, and we have Amos witnessing the Shekhinah on the Mizbeach, on the altar, and according to Chazal, this is the altar which is in the courtyard, so it's even farther out. In essence, the message that both Yeshayahu and Amos are sending is that God is considering or has started to depart from the temple. And we know once God, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, removes itself from the temple, then the temple will be destroyed. So in essence, the message here is that even though until now, it was sort of clear, this is God's home, this is where the divine presence rests, sort of, this is something that cannot be destroyed. So the unfathomable, is starting to being indicated and said by these prophets, that if you continue with this behavior, that we'll study in detail what the behavior was, then there's no security that the Beit HaMikdash will remain. It could be destroyed. And you see that there's an earthquake occurring, meaning this is not firm footing. And you see that they're witnessing, or at least as Moses is saying, I'm witnessing the Shekhinah, but it's no longer inside. It's now outside in the courtyard on the Mizbech. And in other words, it's beginning to exit. Okay, now this is a process that will take a few more 100 years, but this is the message in Ra'iti et Hashem. In other words, why is he telling them Ra'iti et Hashem? It means I saw God and he's not in the same place that he was anymore. He's not in the Kodesh HaKodashim anymore. He's starting his way out from the Beit HaMikdash, and again, as we said, once the temple is destroyed, God is left, and then the rest is exile and everything that came from that point. The next prophet that uses this expression of Reiti Hashem is Yechezkel. Yechezkel is already after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He is sitting in Bavel, in Babylonia, and he is now seeing God. Where is he seeing God? He's seeing God on a chariot, right? That's the Maaseh Merkava. Maaseh Merkava is the chariot. He's seeing God. In other words, he's not even in a house anymore. He's not even in the home. The presence of God, is now moving. It's no longer in one spot. It's no longer in the land of Israel. In Yerushalayim, the Shekhinah has returned to the heavens, and that sort of connection and divine presence that existed previously in history does no longer exist. Okay, so that's sort of tying together the different places of Reiti Hashem. In other words, it's all about these sort of changes in the connection between the divine presence and the world. Okay. All right. Any questions on that or comments? If not, then we'll move on. Okay. All right. So let's go on now to the next pasuk in Perek Vav. Okay. The next pasuk bit that we have in Perek Vav of Yeshayahu is the following description. Sarafim omdim mima'alo, shesh knafayim le'echad, b'shtayim yechaseh panav, u'b'shtayim yechaseh raglav, u'b'shtayim yofef. Okay, so he sees these seraphs, which are these angels, standing in attendance, and each one of them has 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. That's the 6 wings, 3 pairs of wings, 2 for covering the face, 2 for covering the leg, and 2 for flying. Now, the description here in Yeshayahu of what he's seeing is very brief, right? We say he sees God on the throne, he sees these seraphs, and then the next verse is that he hears them praising Hashem, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh Hashem, Tzvaot Meloch Ha'aretz Kvodo. If we compare Yeshayahu to Yechezkel Perek Aleph, it's a very long chapter, describing in incredible detail everything that Yechezkel saw on the heavenly chariot of God, all the different angels, all their shapes, their faces. There's incredible detail in Yechezkel's vision, as opposed to Yeshayahu's vision, which is very brief. Even though they're both witnessing God and the angels and everything surrounding the throne of God, the description in Yeshayahu is relatively quite brief, as opposed to Yechezkel, which is very much in detail. So Chazal, interestingly, ask, why did this occur? Why is Yeshayahu's description so brief and Yechezkel's description so detailed? And they give an interesting answer. And soon we'll actually compare one of the details between Yeshayahu and Yechezkel. But just a sort of basic question, why is Yeshayahu's description so brief if we compare it to Yechezkel? So they give an interesting answer. And they say as follows. This is a Gemara in Chagiga 13b. Amar Rava, Kol shera'a Yechezkel ra'a Yeshaya. למה יחזקאל דומה לבן כפר שראה את המלך, ולמה ישעיה דומה לבן כרך שראה את המלך. So they say as follows. Rava says, all that Yechezkel saw, the prophet Yeshayahu saw as well. But Yeshayahu, in other words, they both had, it's not that Yechezkel saw more than Yeshayahu. In other words, the fact that Yechezkel has more details, it's not because he saw more than Yeshayahu. Yeshayahu also saw a vision with very much detail. The reason Yechezkel described it so much in detail is because he is like a ben kfar shera'a et hamelech. He's like a villager who saw the king, as opposed to Yeshayahu, who is like a city dweller who saw the king. Okay? Very interesting. What does that mean? What are Chazal trying to say here by comparing Yechezkel to a villager and Yeshayahu to the city dweller? So Rashi explains it as follows. ראה ישעיהו ששרתה עליו רוח הקודש, כמו שנאמר, ויראה את השם יושב על כיסא רם ונישא. All right, so it's referring to Yeshayahu's vision here in chapter 6. אלא שלא חש לפרש את הכל. Yeshayahu, he saw a lot of details, but he didn't bother when he was delivering his prophecy. He didn't bother relating all the details that he saw in this vision. Why? שהיה בן מלכים וגדל בפלטין, ובן כרך הרואה את המלך אינו נבהל ואינו תמה ואינו חש לספר. In other words, Rashi says as follows. The reason is Yeshayahu was royalty, right? This is what we mentioned, that Yeshayahu, he was the nephew of the king, the cousin of the king. So he was essentially from the royal family. He was a prince. And therefore, somebody who grows up in a palace, who's used to seeing royalty, he's not so excited by it. And therefore, he doesn't relate, when he comes to describe it, he doesn't provide much detail. As opposed to, let's say, a villager. So if you can imagine, let's say somebody whose royalty is used to seeing palaces. So you would bring him to, let's say, Buckingham Palace, you give him, the tour inside. He's seen all these palaces already. So they're going to ask him, how was it? So we'll give a brief description of what he saw, but he's not going to go into, into very much vivid detail. But you take somebody, a villager who's never seen a palace before, you bringing him to the Buckingham, you bring him inside, you give him the whole tour, he's going to talk for hours about it, telling every little detail he saw because it's all new to him. So essentially, Yeshayahu, this is very interesting because what palace did Yeshayahu here saw? It wasn't a human palace. He saw the heavenly palace. But apparently Rashi is comparing the two. So Yeshayahu had this vision. So he sees throne, he sees angels, he sees all kinds of stuff going on. But apparently it's not completely new to him. And therefore, when he tells about it, so he mentions it briefly. Yes, I saw these angels. They had some wings. And, that's enough for him. As opposed to Yechezkel, who wasn't from a royal family, this whole vision was completely new to him. So he's describing every little detail that he saw in incredible length. Okay, that's the way Rashi explains this Chazal's answer. Tosafot, the commentary on the Talmud, which was written initially by Rashi's grandsons and their students, so they give a different explanation to this passage, and they say as follows: לבן כפר שראה המלך, שצריך לו להביא סימנים אחרים לאחרים קודם שיאמינו, לפי שראו שלא במקומו, ואין דרכו להתראות שם. ואך הנמי אמר יחזקאל שראו על נהר כבר, לפיכך נטמעו שומעיו. Okay, in other words, according to Tosafot, what's going on here? The problem is, according to Tosafot, the issue is not whether, the villager as opposed to the city dweller, that the villager is not used to seeing the king as opposed to the city dweller that's used to seeing the king. Rather, the issue is where he saw the king. In other words, if somebody comes along and says, I saw the king in the capital city, then that makes sense. People believe you. But if you see him in some village and some villager comes along and says, yes, I saw the king today in my village, then that doesn't make any sense. What would the king be doing, in some small village? So therefore, in order to prove to them that he saw the king, he has to provide a lot of details. So, let me give you an example here from Israel. In Israel, if you live in Yerushalayim, you often see the entourage of the prime minister passing by, especially if you live in one of the neighborhoods nearby. You'll see the security forces come, they'll block off all the streets, and then, his whole entourage will pass through. So somebody in Yerushalayim says, oh, I saw the prime minister's entourage today. So, yeah, of course, you live in Yerushalayim, you're about to see him, his entourage pass every once in a while. But if, for example, let's say you live where I live in Ma'ale Adumim, a small city outside Yerushalayim, the prime minister has no business being there unless it's before elections and he's trying to get some votes. But otherwise, he has nothing to look out for here. So if I'll come along and say, oh, I saw the prime minister by my home today, then nobody will believe me. But if so, then what will I have to do? I'll have to tell them, well, I'll have to provide a lot of details. Well, look, there was these two cars that blocked off this road, and the motorcycles here, and then there were this number of cars. And if I'm able to provide so much details, then somebody will say, okay, well, maybe he's telling the truth. Otherwise, he couldn't have seen all that. How does that connect to Yeshayahu and Yechezkel? Yeshayahu is getting his prophecy of Hashem where in Yerushalayim. That's where, or in Eretz Yisrael, that's where prophecy is supposed to occur. Yechezkel is having his vision. He's in Bavel, in Babylonia. Prophecy is not supposed to be, a prophet is not supposed to receive prophecy all the way out in Bavel, in Babylonia. So therefore, people listening to Yeshayahu would accept his word for it because they know this is where prophecy occurs. Yechezkel, who's receiving prophecy in Bavel, which is not supposed to happen, and hasn't happened, for any time in recent history, then that's something odd. And Yechezkel, sort of to prove himself, he has to provide a lot of details. And if he provides so much detail, then people will say, oh, well, I guess maybe he did have this vision. The fact is that he is able to provide all these details. Okay, so that's two explanations as to why we have this difference between Yeshayahu and Yechezkel and regarding the amount of details. Either because Yechezkel, it was more new to him than it was to Yeshayahu, or possibly that Yechezkel sort of had to prove himself more. Okay, Julia wrote here in the chat, so you don't go with the idea that Yechezkel was very mentally ill. Okay, I'm not familiar with that. Could you explain what you? We have Julia here still.
Yeah. I read somewhere about some of the details of Yechezkel's vision, particularly with the creatures. The ones one does make you wonder ever so slightly in today's terms.
Right. Yes. No. Look, it is a very difficult. Yeah.
Not so much the Seraphim one, but some of the other ones. I mean, Dry Bones is lovely, beautiful, but some of the other ones that we readers have to write, somebody wondered whether he serious mental illness. Okay,
I mean, I was just following the explanation of Chazal here. I wasn't familiar with that idea. Look, it's clearly a very difficult a vision to take in. Okay, we're going to focus on just one detail on this vision, which compares to Yeshayahu, and there is an interesting comparison here between Yeshayahu and Yechezkel, and let's go straight to that. And that is regarding the wings. Okay, so we mentioned that in Yeshayahu's visions, he sees 6 wings. What are these 6 wings for on the angels? So it says as follows. Again, 6 wings, each seraph, each one of these angels had 6 wings, 2 to cover the face, 2 to cover the legs, and 2 to fly. Why do they need 2 to cover the face? So Rashi explains, "B'shtayim yechaseh panav shelo yabit letzad shchina." Okay? In other words, the reason the angels wanted to cover their face was so that they won't look at the presence of God, which sort of creates an interesting parallel, because we have here on the one hand Yeshayahu, who was looking, and the Seraphim, they sort of had more respect for the king, and they would cover their face so as not to look directly at the presence of God. Also, we find by Moshe Rabbeinu that he also, hid his face not to look directly. So that's the 2 wings to cover the face. B'shtayim yechaseh raglav. Now they have 2 to cover their legs. Why are they covering their legs? So Rashi explains, "Letzniut shelo yireh kol gufo lifnei boro." In other words, it's for modesty. They covered their legs because they wanted to be sort of dressed modestly in front of the presence of God. They don't actually have clothing, but they do have these wings that they could cover their legs with. Ubetanchuma ra'iti, in the Midrash Tanchuma, Rashi says that he saw there kisui raglaim lefi shehem kekaf regel egel shelo leazkir liYisrael avon ha'egel. In other words, that the reason they covered their legs was that their legs were shaped in the shape of the leg of a calf, and they wanted to cover the calf because that they didn't want to sort of bring to memory the sin of the golden calf. Okay, the famous sin which occurred while Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai. We'll soon see where the Midrash takes this idea from. And 2 wings to fly with, that would they sort of use to serve the Lord. Now, if we compare it to Yechezkel, in his vision, how many wings does he see? He sees only 4 wings. Okay, it says in Yechezkel, ומתוכה דמות 4 חיות, וזה מראיהן דמות אדם להנה. In other words, he sees figures of 4 chayot, 4 types of creatures, and they had the figures of human beings. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. And the legs of each were fused into a single rigid leg. And the feet of each were like a single calf's hoof. This is where the Midrash takes from that the legs were in the shape of the leg of a calf, and their sparkle was like the luster of burnished bronze. Okay, very interesting vision. By the way, the Raglehem Regel Yeshara, this is where we take the idea that in our prayers, we put our, in our Shmoneh Esrei, in the Amida, that we put our legs together as if they're one leg. It's sort of to emulate the angels as they're described here in Yechezkel. However, the interesting point here is that in Yechezkel only sees 4 wings. Now you could say, well, he's not seeing the same angels. In other words, Yeshayahu is seeing the seraphs, the seraphim, which have 6 wings. And Yechezkel is seeing these creatures which maybe for some reason only had 4 wings. That would be one possible way to resolve this contradiction, why here there are 6 wings and here there are 4 wings. In essence, they're witnessing different angels. However, Chazal give a different answer, or rather they give 2 answers to this question. This is also in Chagiga 13b in the Talmud. And there the Gemara says as follows. כתוב אחד אומר 6 כנפיים לאחד, 6 כנפיים לאחד, וכתוב אחד אומר ו4 פנים לאחת ו4 כנפיים לאחת להם. So Chazal are asking this contradiction. Why in Yeshayahu each one has 6 wings, and in Yechezkel each one has 4 wings? לא קשיא, כאן בזמן שבית המקדש קיים, כאן בזמן שאין בית המקדש קיים, כביכול שנתמעטו כנפי החיות. So the answer that Chazal answers is there's a difference between when the temple exists and when it has been destroyed. In the times of Yeshayahu, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash still exists, and therefore the angels have 6 wings. In the time of Yechezkel, Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed, and now they only have 4 wings. Okay. So then the Gemara asks, Haimina yu'imut. So which wings are missing? Okay, if for some reason the destruction of the temple is caused to lose wings, which wings are the ones lost? So the answer is as follows. The first answer that's given, Amar Rav Chanan el Amarav, Otan she'omrot shira bahem. Okay, the ones that they sang their song with. כתיב הכה ובשתיים יופף וקרא זה לזה ואמר, וכתיב התעיף עיניך בו ועיננו. Okay, so won't get into how Chazal are trying to prove this from the verses, but basically they're claiming that 2 wings were used to sing the praise of God, and that praise which was sung by the angels was only in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. Once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, they're no longer singing that song, that praise, and therefore the wings that were used for that are the ones that are missing. Second explanation is, ורבנן אמרים, אותן שמכסות בהן רגליהם. The ones that they're using to cover their legs are the ones that are missing. שנאמר ורגליהם רגל ישרה. ואילאו דאימות מינה הווידע. In other words, Yechezkel is saying, describing the shapes of their legs, right? He said that their legs were straight, that they had the shape of a calf, that they were sparkling. If those legs were covered by wings, how could Yechezkel describe the legs? In other words, if they're covered. It must be that the wings covering the legs are the wings missing. If it weren't that they were the ones that were taken away, removed, how could you know what the legs appeared like? So the Gemara says that's not a proof. Maybe there were wings there, but they opened up for a moment, and that's when he got a brief glimpse of the legs. Right? Because Yechezkel is also describing the faces. And we said that there were two wings that were covering the faces. So how could he describe the faces if they were covered by wings? So it must be that the wings opened up for a moment and he saw the faces, and that's how he was able to describe it. So too, maybe the wings opened up for a second and he saw the legs, and that's how he described it. So the Gemara says, no, it cannot be. In other words, it could make sense that the face would be uncovered for a moment, because that's not considered disrespectful to uncover your face before the Lord. But your legs, since that's something that's considered not modest to uncover, nobody would uncover their legs before their master, before their Lord, and therefore it must be that simply their legs were not covered, because if they had been covered, it would have been considered disrespectful to uncover the legs, and therefore it must be the wings covering the legs that were missing. Okay, so let's try to explain. So basically, just to sum up, we have two answers here in Chazal, interesting answers. Which wings were the ones missing when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed? First one, it was the wings that they sang God's praise with. Second answer, it was the wings covering the legs. Okay, so I'll try, in the 3 minutes we have left, briefly to try to explain both answers. So sort of maybe the easier one to understand is the first answer. Why are the wings used to sing the praise of Hashem? Why are they the ones missing? So let's look at again, what was the praise that they were singing during the times of Yeshayahu? So the praise actually appears in the next verse, in verse number 3 in Yeshayahu, and it says as follows: "V'karazel ze ve'amar, kadosh 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 Hashem tzvaot, melo chol haaretz kvodo." The entire world is filled with the presence of God. When is this true? When is this praise correct? When the Beit HaMikdash still exists, and then the presence of God is evident in the world. How is it evident in the world? Through God's home in this world, which is the Beit HaMikdash. Once the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, is destroyed, we can no longer say Melo chol haaretz kvodo, that the entire earth is filled with the presence of God. Mm-hmm. And if you look in Yechezkel, actually, what does Yechezkel hear the angel singing? He hears the angel singing Baruch Kvod Hashem Mimkomo. Okay, we'll discuss this a little bit in our next Yurim, but Yechezkel is hearing the angel singing a different tune. Baruch Kvod Hashem, blessed is the presence of God, Mimkomo, from its place. In other words, once the temple is destroyed, God's presence is less evident in the world, and the angels are no longer singing the same song that they were singing during the times of the Beit HaMikdash. That's the first answer of Chazal. Second answer was to cover the legs. Why do the legs need to be covered? So Rashi quoted from the Midrash, we saw this earlier, that the legs of the angels were in the shape of a calf. The calf is something that is not good for us. We want to hide that, because the calf sort of brings the memory of the sin of the golden calf. However, one of the interesting things about the sin of the golden calf is that after Moshe Rabbeinu asked for forgiveness for that sin, God's reply to Moshe was, "Ubiyom pokdi ufakadeti alehim." In other words, the sin of the golden calf was never fully atoned for. In other words, God sort of forgave them temporarily. But each time that the Jewish people are punished, part of that punishment is also for the sin of the golden calf. In other words, the sin of the golden calf is something very fundamental, which we haven't completely freed ourselves from. We can sort of cover it up, but it's always there lurking in the background. And when things go to wrong, sort of that lack of proper and true belief in Hashem, which came to light in the sin of the golden calf, sort of that rises up again. So Yeshayahu, when he's saying the legs are covered up, that's essentially a good thing. In other words, it's not completely good because it's still there, but it's sort of, for now, we're not looking at that. That problem of the golden calf, which we've never completely rid ourselves of, is there, but it's currently covered up. We're not looking at that. In the times of Yecheskel, those wings are gone. It's exposed. Because essentially Yecheskel is during the times of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and now it can't be covered up anymore. Now it's all out there, including also the sin of the golden calf, that sort of lack of faith, which came to light in the sin of the golden calf, that sort of now is not covered up anymore and it's being expressed. So that I think is the idea behind the second explanation of the revealing of the legs, which is in essence revealing of the memory of the sin of the golden calf. So both of these explanations, sort of, what they both show is how even the heavenly vision of the angels sort of corresponds to what's happening in this world. So when we have the Beit HaMikdash here, then also the angels have 6 wings. They're singing this praise of Meloch Ha'aretz Kvodo, and our problems are sort of covered up. Yecheskel was speaking when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, so also in his heavenly vision, only 4 wings are there. That beautiful song of God's presence being spread throughout the world is gone, and our blemishes are coming to light, including the memory of the sin of the golden calf. Okay. Any questions or comments?
Thank you. I visited Ezekiel in Babylon.
What?
I visited the tomb of Ezekiel in Babylon.
Wow.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yes, that's a place to, even without Corona, it's difficult to travel.
Yeah, not anymore. Yeah.
Diane, I was very interested in what Julia said about Yecheskel maybe not quite, a little bit sick in the mind, because they say that the handmaid at the sea saw more than the prophet Yecheskel.
Right.
And they weren't sick, and that was in Shevach, that was in praise of them. So I take a little bit of issue with what Julia said. It's very interesting what she said.
Right.
And I identify with what you said about the Prime Minister, because I live very near him, and I often see his entourage going by, and it's nothing.
Right.
But that's just a bit of a joke. Sorry.
Yeah. Look, it's Yecheskel is a problematic prophet. It's not a simple prophet. There were, even in the times of Chazal, there were opinions that wanted to exclude the book of Yecheskel or even parts of it because it seems to contradict sections in the Torah. And eventually they sort of were able to somehow resolve the contradictions. But it is a difficult prophet. It's not like some of the other prophets, although ultimately it was canonized, so we do accept it as part of our tradition. But what Julia said is not completely completely heretical or anything of the sort. It is a very difficult prophet.
No.
Ultimately, it has now found ways to try to interpret Yecheskel in a way that we'll see. The problems, by the way, are not just with this first chapter. There are more towards the end of Yecheskel, where there are some very difficult passages. But they found sort of a way to explain him to fit in with the rest of the tradition.
Because Kabbalah, that's one of the things that Kabbalah studies, Maseh Bereshit and Maseh Merkava, so he must have been exonerated. They wouldn't study it.
He was, but I'm just saying, look, even in Chazal, we have that famous story of the 4 people, Shenichnesu l'Chaldes.
Yes.
Sort of went, and one of them, it says, he cheated and he forgot, he lost his mind. So, this is all dangerous territories, these visions, where we are sort of, taking sort of more simple ideas that come out of them.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, very good to everyone.
Okay, thank you.